Meeting an INFJ often feels less like a social encounter and more like an event that quietly rearranges something inside you. Long after the conversation has ended and the person has exited your daily orbit, their presence lingers, sometimes as a question you keep returning to, sometimes as a new standard for depth, sometimes as an uncomfortable mirror you didn't ask for but can't unsee. This is not accidental, nor is it mystical. From a psychological perspective, the lasting impression INFJs leave is the result of a rare convergence of perception, empathy, restraint, and meaning-making that most people encounter only a few times in their lives. INFJs, as described in the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Framework, lead with introverted intuition. This function does not engage with the world at surface level. Instead, it synthesizes patterns, motives, and emotional undertones. When an INFJ listens to you, they are not primarily hearing your words. They are listening for what the words point to. They notice inconsistencies between what you say you want and what your emotional energy reveals. Most people are rarely seen at this level. As a result, when it happens, it can feel unsettlingly intimate, even if the INFJ has shared very little about themselves. This deep perception creates one of the first reasons INFJs are hard to forget. People often feel profoundly understood in their presence. Not flattered, not validated in a superficial sense, but recognized. The INFJ has an unusual ability to hold another person's inner complexity without rushing to simplify it. They do not reduce you to a role, a label, or a single trait. They sense contradictions and allow them to coexist. Psychologically, this activates a powerful response. Being accurately perceived satisfies a core human need tied to attachment, identity coherence, and self-worth. When someone meets that need, even briefly, the nervous system remembers. Yet perception alone does not explain the lasting mark. Many perceptive people analyze others clinically or use insight as a form of dominance. INFJs pair perception with a strong, values-driven empathy. Their concern for others is not impulsive or sentimental. It is deliberate and principled. They care in a way that feels steady rather than intrusive. This gives their attention a rare quality. It feels safe. In psychological terms, INFJs often provide a temporary secure base, someone with whom another person can think more clearly, feel more honestly, and confront difficult truths without fear of humiliation or exploitation. This is where influence begins to deepen. INFJs do not merely comfort, they reframe. Through carefully chosen words, thoughtful questions, or sometimes a single sentence delivered at exactly the right moment, they help others reorganize their internal narratives. They are natural meaning makers. Rather than telling you what to do, they help you understand why you do what you do. Rather than offering advice, they illuminate patterns you had sensed but never articulated. Cognitive psychology shows that insight-based change, when someone arrives at a realization rather than being instructed, has far greater durability. INFJs specialize in facilitating these moments of insight. If you're ready to unlock your full INFJ potential, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. Another reason INFJs are difficult to forget lies in their emotional economy. They do not flood relationships with constant presence, attention, or reassurance. Their energy is selective. When they show up fully, it feels intentional. When they withdraw, it is usually quiet and unexplained. This creates a psychological contrast effect. Interactions with them feel unusually vivid against the background of more routine social exchanges. Scarcity, when combined with depth, amplifies memory. People replay conversations, revisit expressions, and search for subtext, not because INFJs manipulate, but because their inner world is not easily accessible. Their restraint also contributes to why they're difficult to forget. They reveal themselves slowly, if at all. You may feel you knew them well, only to later realize how much of them remained untouched. From a psychological standpoint, this incompleteness keeps the mental representation of the INFJ open in the mind. Open loops are remembered more strongly than closed ones. The INFJ becomes a reference point rather than a resolved chapter. There is also the matter of moral presence. INFJs tend to live from an internal ethical framework that is quietly uncompromising. They are rarely loud about their values, yet they embody them with consistency. This can be deeply impactful, especially in a world where many people adjust their principles to context or convenience. Encountering someone whose actions, boundaries, and words align creates a subtle but powerful form of influence. People may not consciously register it, but they often find themselves asking later, what would they think about this? Or how would they handle this situation? The INFJ becomes an internalized guide, not through authority, but through integrity. Interestingly, INFJs are often remembered not for what they did, but for how they made people feel about themselves. Some felt calmer. Some felt challenged. Some felt exposed. Some felt inspired to become more honest, more deliberate, more aligned. Emotional memory is more durable than factual memory. The INFJ's influence persists because it is encoded emotionally and existentially, not just socially. Their absence can be as impactful as their presence. When an INFJ leaves someone's life, whether through distance, boundaries, or a quiet withdrawal, it often forces reflection. They do not exit explosively. They leave space. And in that space, people notice the difference between shallow connection and depth, between being talked to and being understood. Loss sharpens perception. The INFJ's influence continues precisely because it is no longer available. From a broader psychological lens, INFJs occupy a rare niche. They combine intuition with empathy, vision with conscience, depth with gentleness. They do not overwhelm the psyche, nor do they fade into the background. They touch something essential, then step back. For many, this becomes a benchmark encounter. The moment they realize that conversations can be richer, relationships more meaningful, and self-understanding more possible than they had previously believed. That is why meeting an INFJ leaves a mark. Not because INFJs try to be unforgettable, but because they engage with the parts of people that are most enduring. They speak to the inner architecture rather than the surface personality. And once that architecture has been seen, or gently shifted, it does not return to its original shape. It reminds me of the popular quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes that says, "A mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions." Another reason INFJs remain unforgettable is the way they engage time. Most people interact in the present tense, reacting to what is happening now, responding to immediate stimuli, solving the problem of the moment. INFJs, by contrast, instinctively operate on a longer psychological timeline. When they speak, they are often addressing who you are becoming, not just who you are today. This creates a peculiar effect. Their words age well. Something they said casually months or even years earlier suddenly resurfaces when you reach a new stage of life, and only then do you fully understand it. Influence that unfolds over time feels almost prophetic, even though it is simply the result of long-range psychological vision. INFJs also tend to occupy a liminal role in people's lives. They are rarely just friends, colleagues, or acquaintances in the conventional sense. They become confidants, catalysts, quiet witnesses to turning points. People often disclose things to INFJs they have never said aloud before, not because the INFJ demands it, but because their presence lowers internal defenses. This places INFJs at psychologically significant moments. Identity shifts, moral dilemmas, emotional reckonings. Human memory prioritizes transitions. We remember who was present when something inside us changed. INFJs are often there, even if silently. There's also the intellectual impact they leave behind. INFJs do not argue to win or debate to dominate. Instead, they introduce perspectives that subtly destabilize rigid thinking. They ask questions that bypass ego defenses and go straight to underlying assumptions. Long after the conversation ends, people find their thinking has been permanently altered. They no longer see an issue in quite the same way. Cognitive psychologists note that belief systems change most durably not through confrontation, but through gentle contradiction that invites reflection. INFJs are remarkably skilled at this form of influence, which makes it both enduring and difficult to trace back to a single moment. Another factor is that INFJs tend to interact without extracting psychological payment. Many social interactions involve unconscious transactions, validation exchange for attention, agreement exchange for belonging, performance exchange for approval. INFJs are less motivated by these dynamics. When they engage, it often feels refreshingly non-instrumental. They're not trying to impress, convert, recruit, or compete. This absence of hidden agenda is rare, and the nervous system notices. Encounters that feel free of manipulation register as unusually clean and trustworthy, and such experiences stand out in memory. INFJs are also hard to forget because they tend to reflect people back to themselves at a higher resolution. After interacting with them, individuals often become more aware of their own inconsistencies, unrealized potential, or misaligned values. This is not always comfortable. Some people remember INFJs with gratitude, others with ambivalence, or even quiet resentment. But both groups remember them. Psychological discomfort, when paired with insight, deepens memory. INFJs are mirrors that do not distort, and mirrors like that are not easily ignored. Their influence also persists because INFJs often plant seeds without insisting on seeing the outcome. They do not need immediate evidence that their words mattered. This non-attachment allows them to speak honestly and precisely, rather than strategically. People later change careers, leave relationships, set boundaries, or pursue callings, only to realize that an INFJ once articulated the very tension they eventually acted on. Influence that is not claimed often feels more authentic, and therefore more powerful. If you're ready to unlock your full INFJ potential, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. There is also something unique about how INFJs handle silence. They are not compelled to fill conversational gaps with noise. Their comfort with pauses allows others to think more deeply and speak more truthfully. Silence, in this context, becomes a psychological space rather than an absence. Many people later remember not just what the INFJ said, but how it felt to sit with them in quiet understanding. Few experiences are as rare or as memorable as being allowed to exist without performance. INFJs tend to subtly recalibrate what people believe is possible in human relationships. After knowing one, shallow exchanges feel more obvious. Performative intimacy feels thinner. People may not consciously compare others to the INFJ, but their internal standard has shifted. Once you have experienced sustained attention, ethical consistency, emotional depth, and intellectual clarity in one person, you know it exists. That knowledge cannot be undone. Another dimension of the INFJ's lasting influence is the way they instinctively validate inner experiences that others have learned to dismiss. Many people move through life subtly doubting their own perceptions, emotions, or moral intuitions because they have been told, explicitly or implicitly, that these inner signals are impractical, exaggerated, or naive. INFJs often recognize these signals as meaningful data rather than flaws. When they acknowledge them in another person, something quietly repairs itself. The individual begins to trust their inner world more. This restoration of self-trust does not fade easily, because it alters how a person relates to their own mind long after the INFJ is gone. INFJs also tend to affect people through what could be called emotional pacing. They neither rush intimacy nor avoid it. Instead, they move at a tempo that allows psychological integration. In fast-paced social environments, people are often pulled into disclosures or bonds they cannot metabolize, which later collapse or feel hollow. With INFJs, the connection develops in a way that feels proportionate and internally coherent. The psyche prefers experiences that can be integrated without fragmentation. As a result, memories of INFJ interactions feel solid rather than chaotic, which makes them more enduring. There is also the way INFJs interact with suffering. They do not minimize pain, nor do they dramatize it. They have a capacity to sit with another person's discomfort without trying to fix it prematurely or even discount it. This is psychologically rare. Many people either turn away from suffering or rush to impose solutions to reduce their own unease. INFJs communicate, often without words, that pain is survivable and meaningful. For individuals going through grief, confusion, or existential uncertainty, this experience can be formative. When someone has been with you at your psychological lowest without recoiling or controlling, that memory becomes anchored very deeply. INFJs are also remembered because they tend to see potential not as fantasy, but as trajectory. They are often able to articulate who someone could realistically become if certain inner conflicts were resolved or certain values honored. Importantly, they do not inflate potential to motivate. They describe it matter-of-factly, almost as an observation. This makes their vision hard to dismiss. Years later, people sometimes realize they are living inside a version of themselves an INFJ once quietly described. Being seen not only as you are, but as you could be, creates a long-term gravitational pull toward growth. INFJs often disengage from relationships at the moment when compromise of values would be required. They tend to leave not when things are dramatic, but when something essential has been crossed. This creates a distinctive psychological imprint. People are left not with an argument to resolve, but with a question to live with. Unlike conflicts that end in noise, these endings end in reflection. The INFJ's absence becomes a symbol of boundaries, of self-respect, of moral clarity. Symbols endure longer than events. INFJs also engage with ideas in a way that fuses the abstract and the human. They can discuss philosophy, ethics, psychology, or meaning without detaching from lived experience. For many people, this is their first exposure to thinking that feels both intellectually rigorous and emotionally grounded. Once that integration has been experienced, purely technical or purely emotional conversations often feel incomplete. The INFJ leaves behind a cognitive emotional template that reshapes how people evaluate depth in dialogue. Another reason INFJs are difficult to forget is that they often give language to experiences that previously felt ineffable. They help people name inner states, relational dynamics, or existential tensions that were felt but not conceptualized. Psychological research consistently shows that naming experience increases agency and reduces confusion. When someone helps you articulate your inner world, they alter your future self-understanding. You may forget who gave you the words, but you continue to think with them. INFJs embody a quiet permission to live more deliberately. They do not preach intentional living, they model it. Their choices, what they engage with, what they refuse, how they allocate attention, signal that life can be lived from the inside out rather than in reaction to external pressure. For many, this is the most lasting mark of all. Once you have seen someone organize their life around meaning rather than momentum, it becomes harder to fully return to autopilot. Another aspect of the INFJ's enduring impact is the way they recalibrate a person's relationship with authenticity. INFJs tend to be unusually congruent internally. What they think, feel, and value are more tightly aligned than in most people. When others encounter this level of inner coherence, it can be quietly disorienting. Many people live with a tolerated split between who they are privately and who they present publicly. Being around an INFJ makes that split more visible, not through criticism, but through contrast. Over time, this can provoke a lasting discomfort with self-betrayal and a stronger pull toward living in alignment, even when it is inconvenient. INFJs also leave a mark because they often hold emotional boundaries that are both compassionate and firm. They are capable of deep care without enmeshment. This combination is rare enough that many people experience it as revelatory. It demonstrates that closeness does not require self-erasure, and that kindness does not require limitless access. Psychologically, this provides a corrective experience, particularly for those accustomed to chaotic or codependent relationships. Once someone has felt cared for without being consumed or controlled, it permanently alters their expectations of intimacy. There's also something distinctive about how INFJs remember others. They tend to retain details, not in a trivial way, but in a way that signals significance. They remember the emotional essence of what mattered to you, not just the facts. When this later reappears in conversation, it creates a sense of continuity and depth that most relationships lack. Feeling remembered at the level of meaning, rather than data, strengthens relational memory on both sides. The bond feels anchored rather than episodic. INFJs are also difficult to forget because they often refuse to collude with self-deception. They do not aggressively call it out, but they also do not reinforce narratives that protect the ego at the expense of truth. Their responses often gently redirect attention toward what is real rather than what is comfortable. Over time, this can make people more honest with themselves, even in the INFJ's absence. Once self-deception has been quietly exposed, it loses some of its power. That shift persists. INFJs are also rarely forgotten because of how they engage with responsibility. They tend to take psychological responsibility seriously, responsibility for their words, their impact, their choices. They rarely externalize blame reflexively. For people accustomed to environments where accountability is performative or absent, this can be striking. It introduces a different model of maturity, one in which responsibility is not a burden, but an expression of agency. That model, once witnessed, often becomes an internal benchmark. They leave a lasting impression through their relationship with power. They are typically uninterested in overt dominance, status games, or social leverage, yet they often possess significant influence. This paradox, impact without force, can be deeply memorable. It challenges the assumption that effectiveness requires aggression or self-promotion. People may later find themselves imitating this quieter form of influence, even unconsciously, because it felt both ethical and effective. INFJs often articulate moral or existential questions that others avoid. They bring attention to meaning, purpose, and long-term consequence without sounding grandiose. These questions tend to stay active in the psyche long after the conversation ends. Unlike answers, questions linger. INFJs leave behind questions that continue working on people from the inside, shaping decisions over years rather than moments. INFJs often exit relationships having left people with a clearer sense of their own inner world. Even when the relationship ends, there's a feeling of having been mapped in some essential way. The INFJ helped trace emotional contours, values, contradictions, and longings. Once that map exists, the person can never fully return to psychological vagueness. They know themselves better than before, and that knowledge becomes part of their ongoing life. INFJs are remembered not because they dominate attention, but because they alter orientation. After knowing one, people often move through the world with slightly different questions, different tolerances, and different standard for themselves and others. That kind of influence does not announce itself, but it endures, quietly shaping lives long after the INFJ has stepped out of the picture.